I'd just like to start the conversation off with asking each of our panelists how they first came to outsider art. What was it that, that drew them to outsider art? If anyone wants to kick off.
Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'm the oldest, I'll start. Well, the answer is really quite simple. I was a student at the Royal College of Art in the late 1960s, and I came across a book in a bookshop called Though This Be Madness, which was about 3 psychotic artists. And I bought it, and I was absolutely amazed by the work in this book. And in fact, I spent several weeks trying to sort of work myself up, down, sideways, I don't know, however you do it, into a sort of what I imagined to be a psychotic state, not with any great success. I'd also always been interested in surrealism and the art of mad people, but that particular book was the one that first sort of turned me on to a very vivid range of images, and it just kept on going from there.
Well, I'm not quite sure quite how I came to it, also quite accidentally. As you were talking about surrealism, I remember that my French teacher used to show us Buñuel in the lunch break. So quite possibly that interest in slightly left of field art and film led to the fact that when I first started to see some pieces of work which were American folk art, they just appealed to me because they weren't what I was used to seeing here. And really, as with any journey, you know, I got a bit into it, and then you go a bit further, and then you find something else interesting. And before you know it, you're looking at work from a whole range of different creators, which I was, from different walks of life, and then that, you know, work by people with disabilities or in institutions. So it became a very organic journey. So that would be my...
Great.
I suppose my experience is a bit similar to David's. I was at St Martin's, and towards the end of the course there, you had to write a thesis on art, and I was looking for something to write about, and I came across a book in the library there. I think it was just called Outsider Art, and I suppose what I latched onto was, after having been in an academic institution for going on for 3 years, the idea of people creating art through some kind of inner compulsion rather than to be, you know, to get a grade or something like that. The idea of people just having to do it without really thinking about it appealed to me, and I kind of latched onto it and thought, yeah, this is it. They should shut all art colleges down, and then people would just make art because they had to do it and all this kind of thing. Got very gung-ho about it. Got a terrible mark for my thesis, obviously, because not a very good thing to say that the college should be shut down, is it, I suppose? So that was the start of it, yeah.
So I guess the question is, why is it that we, as viewers, are so fascinated by outsider art? I mean, is there something that makes the artwork particularly current? And I ask you, James, because Museum of Everything has had quite a large success in terms of attendance over the period that it's been open now. What are your feelings on that?
Sorry. I didn't think as many people liked it as seemed to. And I personally didn't think as many people would respond to it as hadn't had exposure to it. So, you know, from my personal opinion was that I found it really fascinating. I, like Jarvis, really like the idea that people make work not because they want to sell it or they're told to, but because they need to. And that had a real truth and authenticity for me that I just liked. And also when pardon me, the aesthetic really appealed to me. So things look astonishing, really quite unlike anything else that I'd seen. But it can look a bit crazy. And, you know, in that sort of very typical sense of the word, which is why it's surprising that so many people have embraced it. That said, what prompted me quite a lot to make the exhibition was that I was looking at a lot of contemporary work, and it was my gut feeling that, particularly amongst many young contemporary artists, they were looking at work like this and imitating it. And it occurred to me that if people were really enjoying this aesthetic, it might be interesting for them to see the source of a lot of these aesthetics. So, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, can I just say something at this point?
Yeah.
I think, of course, that this is a theme that will probably recur in the conversation. There is an unknown quantity of extraordinary work, even now, after this field has been sort of dug up and excavated and all the rest of it for something like 50-odd years, since Dubuffet coined the term art brut, which is the sort of forerunner of outsider art. So the work itself is often, as James has said, quite amazing, and kind of you think, how on earth did this person kind of come up with this? But I think that what makes us crazy about or fascinated by outsiders is also a cluster of images. And these are partly images about some kind of creativity that owes absolutely nothing, or seems to owe absolutely nothing, to going to art school or getting an arts council grant or whatever. And also, I think, the figure of the outsider, someone who is not really part of it, doesn't belong, is a sort of misfit or outcast. And there are quite a number of different ways of being a misfit or an outcast. And I think this is a particular attraction at the moment, because you mentioned, you know, what makes this work current, Gino. I think my guess is that one of the things that makes it current is that we live in an increasingly homogenized society where, you know, there are all sorts of different costumes and roles, but, you know, one or another of them you're going to have to step into, or you feel like you're going to have to step into anyway. And the outsider seems to be somebody who, in a mysterious way, is immune from this. You know, it hasn't taken, the inoculation hasn't worked, you know, and they just don't do it. So I think that is, you know, that these images are also very, very powerful and very fascinating.
So would you say that part of our appeal stems from a kind of voyeurism around what we would see as eccentric, concerning the kind of the artists themselves?
Yes, I mean, if you're asking me, I think that we are not just interested in the work. I had terrible run-ins with dear old Phyllis Kind, a well-known American dealer in outsider art and a terrific spirit, and she insisted that, you know, it was the work that was embodied the creativity, and the artist's life story was, in a sense, irrelevant. And I don't agree with her. I think that the artist's life story is more relevant in the case of outsider art than any other art, and it's pretty relevant in the art world in general, let's face it. Why? Well, because we need to know, as far as we possibly can, that this person did never get any instruction, possibly didn't even think of themselves as an artist, was shut away for X number of years in one or another form of seclusion, etc., etc. And we need to know this because this, if you like, authenticates their status as an outsider. In addition to that, I maintain vigorously, certainly I'd speak for myself in this respect, that I'm fascinated by what I imagine to be the state of mind of the person who made this work. And we've already had one thread of this, which is the idea that this person is driven by some kind of incredibly powerful need or compulsion to make a work. But there are many other features, and some outsider work is undoubtedly, psychologically, very strange. I mean, take Henry Darger, for example, you know, a very obvious and dramatic example. And I think we are fascinated by that aspect And I say it's an aspect we often have to imagine. We may have a very small amount of actual data to go on. Don't know what you think about that, James.
No, I agree that I'm sure that had something to do with it when I first read this book, and you read about the people's biographies, and you know, it seems very fascinating. You mentioned Henry Darger, and like he was a janitor, and he produced all this work over all this time, and nobody ever found out about it until he died. And so the stories are quite interesting, just as stories. But I do. You would talk about the currency of it, and I think you know, part of the reason why your gallery has been popular, I wouldn't like to think that it was just like people going, oh, let's go and see what art crazy people can make. I think that it goes beyond that, in that somehow these people have sidestepped, like you say, the normal conditioning things that happen within society, and that shows a form of creativity that people recognize in some way. It's not so alien, like it's not like, oh God, this is being beamed in from another planet. It's like something that other people could do. It's kind of like they're tapping into, because they're not tapping into the normal stimuli that are present, in some way they're tapping into something deeper, and something that's shared. You know, it's like a shared consciousness kind of thing.
Of course, in the case of mediumistic art, it has been beamed in from another planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I must say, I agree. I agree a bit with both of you, but I particularly agree with you, Jarvis, that, I mean, I guess I've seen it from a couple of perspectives. I've seen it from the perspective of liking it and getting into it. I've definitely liked the fact that it was weird and that other people don't like it, and been kind of voyeuristic about life stories. But then when you get over that, which you do eventually, then you start looking at the work. And what's, for me, you know, standing in that gallery and looking at people come, we had quite a lot of people today, and they're just into the pictures, they're into the sculptures, they're looking at the art, and they're not looking in a prurient fashion. They're not looking at the biographies, and I made a sort of political decision that we weren't going to put biographies all around the work. We were going to put them at the end, and there is some information that comes out, but I thought it was important not to dwell on those life stories, because in many ways, if you know the life story first, then it taints your enjoyment of it. So, you know, the best example I can think of is we have, or there are, these enormous woolly sculptures by an artist called Judith Scott, who, well, when you see them, there's something, even if you don't like them, there's something very strong about them. And a lot of people come and say, you know, these are the most amazing things, what are they? And then you say, well, actually, they're the only form of communication this woman had. So it adds a layer of meaning. And then when you reveal that she had Down syndrome, and she was a twin, and then there's a famous photo of her holding one of them, and you know, when you look at it, you think, well, is she holding her twin? All these factors come in. But if it was just the meanderings of her mind, and that mind wasn't very coherent, it wouldn't be interesting. But actually, the very strong aesthetic, they're incredible, to the point that certain curators say, well, they're very important sculptures of the last century, because they question what art is and what it isn't. But I don't think that's inextricably linked. All I guess I'm saying is that the biography is there and the art is here, but I certainly don't think one is more important than the other.
See, it's interesting that, as far as I know, and I'm welcome to be very corrected, no one has ever yet made what seems like a very basic experiment to follow on from what you've been saying, which is to exhibit the work of outsider artists alongside the work of other artists with no identifying information to distinguish one from the other, and see whether, in fact, the people who come to the exhibition, as it were, receive the work in...
But I actually thought they tried to do that in the Whitechapel show, which was in 2006, because no, really?
Well, I mean, they may have tried to do it, but they certainly didn't manage to. But go on.
No, I just remember someone telling me people got really pissed off because they went, well, I want to see which one's an outsider and which one's not, which goes to the heart of saying, well, actually, you know, does it really matter? There's definitely it's complicated. I think that there's a category, and people certainly fit in. And if you have certain attributes, you'll kind of fit into this world, which isn't quite the same one as the art world over here. But I don't think it's a fixed plane.
Well, I guess what that raises is an interesting question around why, up until now, has there not been a successful or comprehensive show of outsider art in the UK? I mean, James, you said you came to outsider art through US folk art, and of course we've already had reference to the Whitechapel show, which you seem to be in agreement about. So why do you think there's been that resistance up until now?
Well, there was a show, of course, before the Whitechapel show, which was was it 1979 Outsider show at the Hayward, I think, which, as far as I can tell, aroused an enormous interest amongst artists in particular. So it's not a completely blank slate.
Fair enough.
But there isn't a permanent museum, is there? You know, like you've got the Museum of Folk Art in the US and stuff.
No, and one of the things, I mean, this of course raises another difficult issue. One of the things I really liked about the Museum of Everything was that it didn't look or feel in the least bit like a museum. And it really seemed to suit the work that was in it, you know, to a T. Now, you know, the classic instance of what happens to outsider art in a museum, I suppose, is the Collection de l'Arbre in Lausanne, which is beautifully displayed in a sort of very sepulchral space, rather like this theatre, you know, things sort of loom out of the gloom at you. But it is a museum. I mean, there's absolutely no getting around it. And some aspect, maybe, I don't know what the two of you think, but some aspect of the work sort of gets muted as a result.
Well, I guess because the stuff hasn't been created with that in mind. It's not created with a view to it being exhibited.
Well, in some cases, of course. I mean, Ville made elaborate plans for the printing of his work. There were whole pages of computations of the compound interest to be gained from the sales of his work and so on. So, I mean, whether you call that an intention to show his work or not is a bit debatable. But I mean, it's certainly Ferdinand Cheval, who built the Palais Ideal, was very keen for people to come and visit it. It's not always the case that it's created in total secrecy and kind of without any audience in mind. But
that's kind of like a fantasy audience, though, isn't it?
Well, hey, I mean, look, you know, we all create for a fantasy audience, don't we?
I think the fantasy audience is a huge factor. I mean, Henry Darger, by all accounts, thought he alternated between I'm the greatest artist in the world and I'm no one, and would tell the few people who he encountered how good he was. And the delusions of grandeur that Wolfley has, like, I don't know how big it is. It's this just lifetimes work of these books and manuscripts and etchings, and they go right to the edge of the paper. And if actually that's the proof that they would never know how to exhibit it, because they use every square inch of the paper. It's impossible to hang, and they're all double-sided. So I mean, actually, if there is in that particular area, because I don't think that's true of maybe folk art like Howard Finster, but in that particular area, there's no real, I don't believe, any real sense of an audience. The audience is created and loving the work in an imaginary scenario that feeds back into the work.
So I think this idea of an imaginary audience is a very good one. And, I stick to what I said. I think that many artists, certainly myself when I'm making my art, I'm not thinking of, a particular bunch of people like, all of you out there who might be seeing my work, but there's a sort of it's a sort of floating gossamer kind of ghostly audience, And I'm interested in finding out what the two of you think about how this sits with something which we're definitely skirting around the edge of, which is deep-seated privacy and solitude that's involved in outsider art. It seems as though this work is, as near as any work ever is, made only for the person who's created it. So how does, we've got sort of three things here, really. We've got complete and utter solitude. We've got a sort of phantom audience. And then we've got, a more or less realistic audience of more or less real people.
Well, if I could
I could say a lot, but I don't want to.
I think
hog
part of the difficulty of responding to that is the breadth of work and styles of work that you find in outsider art, or that is classed as outsider art, because outsider art is of itself not a genre. So I suppose to have a set of rules per se, which go beyond merely saying that this is something that exists outside of the mainstream, seems to me slightly at odds with all of these kind of forms of work that you find within outsider art.
Well, you see, you say it's not a genre, and it is and it isn't. Outsider art is not a genre in the same way that Cubism or Impressionism or Constructivism or whatever is. Because, when these movements were set up, you, as it were, signed up to be a Cubist or a Surrealist or whatever. It's an almost unique characteristic, I would say, of outsider art, that people don't say, hey, or at least until recently they didn't say, hey, I'm an outsider artist, look at me. We come along and say, look at this, it's outsider art, So that's a very peculiar feature.
I would say that goes to the root of why it's a crap term, because I actually get quite a lot of people coming up and going, hello, I'm an outsider artist, and including Jarvis, but they might be right, but by the same count, that self-awareness makes you question it. There's a chap called George Widener who has savant abilities, and he's got, Asperger's. And he came into the outsider field. If you ask George where he's at now, he says, well, I used to be an outsider artist, but I'm a contemporary artist now. And it's not a helpful definition. I think the definition is very much ours. And if, in my view, and it's only my view, if you look at the history has been formed by very smart people who've had an agenda. If they're doctors, they definitely have an agenda, even though that agenda might be a good one. Dubuffet had an extremely strong agenda, and that it changed over time, particularly, as he involved that work in his practice. You can see it in his practice, and you can see sometimes the particular artist that he's looking at. And at the same time as he cared for it, one of the interesting things I saw at the Whitechapel show was some letters he wrote to an artist called Scotty Wilson, and Scotty Wilson was being a little too knowing for Dubuffet's tastes, and these letters sort of illustrate the fact that he didn't like it very much. I guess a bit like, who was
Dubuffet didn't like it.
Yeah, Dubuffet didn't like it, and who's the French guy who paints the posts? Chassac. Yeah, he had a similar problem. And then it's a little bit about the definition, but it's also about the fact that, if you're a sensitive character, shall we say, or a private person, or you have a disability, but you know that you've become popular and you see it in your life, you change just like any artist would change. And I'm rambling around an idea, but coming back to the basis of it, of whether there's a genre, there is a genre, because I think there are certain boxes that get ticked that kind of go, you're over in that area. But it's not something so clear as an outsider, and an outsider is really quite I feel it's an us term, not a them term, so to speak.
Well, it's an us term by definition, because, we create outsider artists, and we create them in order to satisfy our needs. We may not even be fully conscious.
To be inside. To be inside. I think that's why you, apart from people, now we live in an age where if you're an outsider, but it's much cooler to be an outsider, or maybe to be back inside. But it definitely creates a very strong division. And it's complicated.
Well, I mean, I'm always reminded of Groucho Marx's quip that he would never join any club that would be prepared to accept him as a member. And I think, that's a probably pretty good attitude for an outsider who's on the cusp of being recognized or taken up.
Well, I think that kind of leads into one of the points that you discuss in your book, David, about kind of how outsider artists who are taken up and are being recognized by collectors are personally affected, and how their practice may be affected. And I think James touched on that briefly as well, saying all artists change, or their work changes with recognition. What's your feeling on that?
Well, there are undoubtedly cases where outsider artists have been exploited, or, I mean, I suppose the best known example in this country is Albert Loudon, who was discovered by Victor Musgrave, had in the end a show at the Serpentine Gallery, which was a complete, I believe, sellout. And precisely because of that, in a funny kind of a way, I won't say that he was ostracized by the outsider art community, but a sort of cloud of suspicion sort of hung over him, So, and in a way, that cloud of suspicion was there regardless of what happened to him as a person or to his work. He'd sort of lost his outsider innocence somehow, But I think we are now at an historical point where more and more outsider artists are going to be discovered during their lifetime. Some of them, whether we like it or not, will already have had some waft or inkling of, there's this thing called outsider art, buddy, if you, knock on the right door and so on and so on. It has diluted in some ways what I suppose in Dubufay's day seemed like, and I underline seemed, because a very kind of clear-cut situation. There was mainstream culture, which as far as Dubuffet was concerned included avant-garde art, even Van Gogh, for heaven's sake. It was all kind of, over-sophisticated and so forth. And there was this quite different art brut, this crude, raw, primitive, innocent art. And as many of you will probably know, Dubuffet, who discovered quite a few people while they were still alive, said to some of them, Raphael Launay, for example, for God's sake, don't start exhibiting your work in galleries, not because Launay would suffer, but because the work would suffer. It would become too self-conscious.
That's quite a patronising attitude, isn't it? To kind of say, I know what's best for you.
Yeah, you could call it that, yeah. It's protective, which leaks into patronising, for sure.
It's definitely patronising, and worse still, it's sometimes right.
Yeah.
I mean, you definitely see some artists go down the tubes once they get more popular and not be able to sustain that thing. But it's definitely, I think that's part of the grey area. But I completely agree with you. You see it a lot in France, actually, where art brut has, really firm rooting and is collected by the surrealists. And there's a very strong intellectual vigor there that takes away probably from the emotional appreciation, which is what attracts me. And I think and I think it's very different to your approach, David, but the real over-intellectualization does become quite patronising because it's sort of connected.
Well, it starts lots of problems, doesn't it, when it gets more complicated when the work gets discovered. I don't know if they still have it, that they have like an outsider art fair in New York. They used to have it, I think,
It's just been.
Yeah, and I remember going to that and being quite kind of disturbed because, it looks like a normal art fair. You've got all the stalls and stuff, and some of them would have like one of the outsider artists kind of stood at the side of his work, kind of twitching slightly. And it seemed very exploitative. It was like a kind of freak show thing.
Yep.
And I suppose that's that's one of the things when we started this discussion, talking about people creating things for a compulsion and from a compulsion and without an eye on a value beyond what it meant to them. Obviously, it gets complicated when then value does get put on that work and how that kind of affects it.
Yeah, I mean, I think an excellent and really, in some ways, rather sad example of this is in Austria, what used to be called the Artist's House at Gögging, which was founded by a psychiatrist very, very sympathetic to art, Dr. Leo Navratil, and he gathered together a kind of cohort of patient artists, and they were put in a special building, and they were given better materials than I could afford, and encouraged to make work, and their work was exhibited, and some of them actually went. I mean, some of them even went to New York, for heaven's sake. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I mean, it's very, very mixed. Anyway, a lot of these artists became, in their way, quite famous. People like Oswald Chitner or Johann Hauser and so on, and rightly so, because they produced amazing work. But now, that stable of psychiatric patients, stroke artists, call them patient artists, who were sort of built up by Navratil, they're all getting old. They're all 70, 80 years old. I was at Gögging last year, and there was a big opening of Michel Nedjar, and there were half a dozen of these people, just like you say, I mean, like standing there kind of, almost as though they were as much on show as old-fashioned psychiatric patients as the work they made was. And I felt pretty uncomfortable. I didn't know what I could possibly do to sort of, break this. Anyway, to get to the point that I want to make, this artist's house has now been completely rebranded by Johann Feilacher, and it's now called A/Brut Center Gögging. And it's become a sort of bizarre museum, not just of the art that's made there, but of these kind of old, doddery patients who are the sort of last survivors, really, because for some reason or another, Gögging doesn't seem to be able to attract or hold any new outsider artists.
It's actually even worse. It's become a gallery, and the chap who runs it hauls in works from across the world and sells them for double what they were costing anyway. And I think it really goes to the heart of it, because actually Gögging was great because of Navratil, who was the doctor, and he was the pioneer who said, well, actually the therapy is going to help my patients. And once he got knee-deep into it, and my limited knowledge of it, and you certainly have more, David, that actually it got momentum of its own, and he marketed them to the world as artists, which became part of their therapy, not just in terms of them making the art, but in terms of their perception and how they were connecting to the rest of the world. And that really, I think, goes back to an earlier point, I think you maybe made, Jarvis, about people in general connecting to the work, because there's a proportion that comes out of disability, but it's certainly not all of it. It's not. I wouldn't say it's probably around 20% if you look at all the work as a whole, but others are sort of connected somehow. And really, for me, they go to the heart of is. I didn't get into it to buy work by people with a disability. I wasn't interested in people with a disability. But as I've got drawn towards that kind of work, I realized how meaningful it was. And when you look at it, I think what happens is you start to look at yourself, because somehow there's a connectivity between the immediacy which that work comes out of, the situation of that person and the way they're communicating. And the communication is very direct. So the awful sadness in the scenario that you're presenting there is that something that was really quite astonishing in terms of not only the individuals but the way what it gave back to the world suddenly became just a free market thing, and it was about money again.
It's not just that it's about money, it's become sort of fossilized. It's got frozen somehow. I mean, that's just one particular...
But it does, I think it happens a lot, actually, and which maybe is also different to, like, Jarvis's experience. We showed his film at the museum, and maybe he could talk about that, because that's actually, you dealt with a lot of living, talking, artists.
Yeah, well, that was a film a series that was on Channel 4 about 12 years ago. And I travelled through France and then through America, visiting as many outsider artists and speaking to them as I could. I suppose the main thing that I got from that was I kept asking people why they made stuff. And they all would look at me as if that was the most stupid question they'd ever heard in their lives. Eventually I kind of cottoned on to the fact that there wasn't a question of why, it was just like, it felt like it was the right thing to do, so you would just make it. There was you never really questioned why you were doing it. I think Howard Finster had the best explanation. He said, well, if you had an itch on your head and you asked me to scratch it, I wouldn't know where to scratch it, would I? I said, no. I said, but I know exactly where to scratch it, and that's what I do. So it's just like, for him, it was like scratching an itch. It was something that it was like almost like a reflex action. And I think that's the thing, so a lot of what you see is it's people who are marginalised in some way, for whatever reasons, and then they cotton on to something that gives them control or gives them structure and gives meaning. And then as soon as they've cottoned on to that thing, whether it's stapling lots of plastic dolls together or building piles of concrete or whatever, then that thing becomes their kingdom, their world, their thing that they're in charge of. And so finally they've got some control over their life. And I guess that's why it's weird then when it gets unearthed and people look at it, they look at it in a different way. It's not performing that function anymore.
Actually, I'm tempted just to kind of turn that, I agree with what you've just said, but you could also turn it upside down and say, and I think this is something which reaches a peak in outsider art, but is there in other artists. I, to a very tiny extent, feel it myself, which is that, it's not that you're in control of the work is in control of you. Because I do genuinely believe that there are various kinds of madness involved in making at least certain kinds of art. Materials come alive, the work seems to want to go in a direction which you hadn't anticipated. At some point you have to, as it were, hand some degree of autonomy over to the work. I guess the most dramatic example of this would be something like automatism.
I wonder, David, just with regards to that, you say that it's a case of giving yourself over to the work. In some instances of outsider artists, they may never have actually set out to produce any work up until the point where they were confronted possibly with their first art therapy lesson. As an art therapist, if you put that hat on for us, how would you...
It's probably a helmet. Well, I have to say that, first of all, art therapy has had an appallingly bad press from people like Michel Tevos, who's a well-known French intellectual writer about outsider art and who claims that art therapy has a sort of totally normatizing effect. I suppose some art therapy may be like that, but I think art therapy is about trying to enable people to do what they want or need to do, and not about sort of imposing something on them. Nevertheless, I think the relationship between art therapy and artistic creativity is a very strained one. Art therapists in their training are almost forbidden to see the work that their patients make from an aesthetic point of view. They look at it from a psychological angle, fine. But, if they look at it, this all goes all the way back to C.G. Jung, really. If they look at it from an aesthetic point of view, I suppose the the sort of fantasies, they'll become bewitched and entranced by the aesthetic aspect, and they'll overlook the fact that this is a serial child molester or whatever, you know. However, having said all of that, I mean, I do think some art therapists really do watch out for, protect, nurture the creativity of the people that they work with. And I personally happen to have had the experience once, and only once, of working as an art therapist with somebody who subsequently became recognized as an outsider artist. And actually what I did was completely against the book, because I had to work with this person. He's Richard Nye, his name is, and he was in the Inner Worlds Outside show. I had to work with him with a sort of two-pronged approach. One prong was a therapeutic prong, terrible thing, therapeutic prong, the mind boggles, and the other was an artistic prong, where I would actually sometimes say, oh, this is a very good paper if you want to use wet ink or whatever, you know. Or, well, actually, to begin with, it was actually stopping him from destroying his work. I mean, you know, he just threw most of it away. And thank goodness he doesn't now. And incidentally, he hates being called an outsider. But I think he ticks too many of the boxes. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule. There are all sorts of other things I could go into. I mean, it's not always the art therapist's fault. It's something to do with the conditions and circumstances, as well as the professional spectacles that they feel bound to put on.
I know I remember someone telling me there's Japanese art brut in sort of that purest sense is really super cool, and somehow has been very strongly affected by this Japanese aesthetic. But I did hear that in the Japanese workshops where that you're talking about, where they're artists or art therapists working, that there is this sort of, there used to be a culture of like, no, not good enough, throw it away, from the therapists, where they were really, you have to do it properly. But I want to also, I guess I'm just free associating to what you said. I have particular experience. I sometimes work in film, and I've been making a film with somebody who has what they call is DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, which is multiple personalities. And actually it was, and this maybe goes to the other side of it, not going and looking at it, but it for the people who are making it. This particular person has 30 personalities, and when she discovered art therapy, a dozen of them started to make work. And every night at 3 a.m, she would go into the room, start painting, and when the paint went to dry, she would switch to another personality. And each of these personalities now was expressing themselves on paper. So instead of just being, it had been a very long journey for this woman. So even to get to the point where people weren't dosing her up and saying you're a schizophrenic, and to the point that she had this disorder, was a big step. But then to actually get over that disability and say, well, actually you can call yourself an artist now, meant a lot to her. And she's called Kim Noble, and she's out there in the world, and her main personality is almost the curator for the other personalities, which is quite complicated, and the work is all different, and there's some crossover. But really the point was, actually, I think art therapy is a great tool, and it's making people better. Although the big thing there is, you don't have to like it just because it comes out of art therapy. It could be rubbish. It could just be therapy for that person. And what distinguishes it a bit, I think, and certainly from my point of view, is that you don't want to like it because you're sentimentally attached to it. You want to like it because there's something astonishing there, which actually you've never seen before. Yeah.
And are all the 12 personalities, do they do pictures in different styles?
Yes.
I think what's interesting is partly what Jarvis spoke about earlier as well, was the fact that outsider art was about kind of works being discovered, and James, you were just saying pretty much the same thing, in that actually it's about seeing something that hasn't been seen before. Are we still seeing that in outsider art? Are we, as the viewers, still being confronted with that which has not been seen before?
Well, it's more difficult for people to exist completely outside of culture now. I mean, that was one thing that I noticed when we made the film. Most of the people we spoke to were in the 70s and 80s. A lot of them have died since then. And I wouldn't know, I'm not as knowledgeable, but it seemed that it was it was an aging population who were producing this stuff. I guess that is because it's kind of impossible to grow up without seeing the telly or something, or in some way being affected by the dominant culture.
See, I think it takes. Sometimes people are, never had it in the first place, whatever it is, acculturation, education, professional training, or whatever. And in a sense, you could say, whatever other misfortunes they may have, they're the lucky ones. And then other people, and I would even include myself in this bunch, have to kind of like batter or creep under or through the back door somehow. As Dr. Janos Marton, who runs a fantastic studio space attached to Creedmoor Hospital in New York, as Janos Marton says, people who have mental health problems are blessed with creativity to an unusual extent. Now, that's a very contentious statement, and I certainly don't agree with it as a blanket statement, because I've worked with lots of people with mental health problems whose creativity is kind of totally blanketed, muffled, stifled, or whatever. But there are still a significant proportion of people where there seems to be this strange kind of short circuit between being unbalanced, disordered, or whatever you want to call it in many aspects of your life, and either in spite of or because of that, having these incredible creative gifts. Now, going back to what we were talking about 5 minutes ago, I really don't know to what extent one could or could not call that therapeutic. I think that getting deeply involved with art is quite dangerous. There should be a health warning on Winsor & Newton pastels or whatever.
I think there is. So, it's interesting. I have a different opinion today than I did maybe 6-8 months ago before we did the museum. And my big thing is, my big awakening perhaps, is that creativity is basically exercise. That it's very fundamental to almost everybody, and I do believe the reason we're connected to the work, and back to your first question, Gino, that the work is attractive because it's so fundamental to us. And when art therapy works, it works in the same way as exercise. I also think that the relationship to the dominant culture is hugely important. Some of the best people are gone. They're dead. The best work, the reason that Henry Darger is so good is because he spent his entire life on one idea in his room with no input. No input is just such a great thing. We did have no input on the museum, so I'm convinced it's really the thing. But he was the boss of one idea for that long, and I think whether you're a so-called outsider artist or just a regular common or garden artist, 60 years on one idea is enough to really do it well. But particularly to hide yourself away is just really hard these days. To be a hermit, I don't know any. And
you wouldn't, would you?
Well, I think I would have. I think I would have 100 years ago. I would have gone. I'm going to see Jarvis the hermit in his cave.
Okay, can I just chip in something here, because in one sense you're right, but you see, people like Darger or Ville or Alois actually did have a connection to the wider culture. It's not what you might call an orthodox connection. In Darger's case, he was tapping into this whole kind of sentimental ersatz world of cute little girls in kind of little dresses skipping and jumping and, a whole... And along with those kind of very kitschy, sentimentalized images, on some level, And, I have no idea whether to the extent to which he was aware of it or not, Darja was also tapping in to the underside of that. And this is a very, very current issue in terms of, adults and child sexual abuse and so on, because, you cannot have the Sanforized little girl, cute, sweet, without actually also importing at the same time something dark and strange and sinister and so on. And Darja was, handling that, in his own very strange way. So in that sense, to me, he's plugged right into the American unconscious, collective unconscious.
James, what do you think to that?
Well, I have an opinion. I think there's an element of truth, but I think that's more highfalutin, shall I say, than I would describe it as. I think there's a connection because he's taking pictures out of magazines and he's looking at advertising. So his materials are those of popular culture, but they're very popular culture. And they're also the materials of his childhood because they're comic books, which are his main reference. I think that this goes to a slightly different problem, which is one of projection. Henry Darger was because he was discovered by his landlord and not by one of us. His work was split up very early, so you don't get a sense of the opus of the giant thing that it was, which was effectively one. Apart from a few bits on the side, was one long story, and the one long story is his story, and his story is that he was a child who was sent to a home and was abused in the home and saw the abuse and ran away and then spent his life in sort of menial jobs. And when you really look at the work and you actually look at the narrative, that's exactly what the narrative is. It's about a bunch of girls who are always on the run from adults, and when the adults catch them, they sort of attack them in these very visceral pictures that are what gave Darger a bad name. But in some ways look more like a Roadrunner cartoon than Jake and Dinos. And then they escape again, they run away again. And the more information we get, the closer that seems to be the truth. So for example, there's a film coming out where the filmmaker discovered that in the home, the boys were dressed up as girls, which probably is an indication of why you've got girls with willies running around the countryside. Might not be, but just putting simple things together like that. So I think it's actually about somebody who used the art to deal with, humongous an impact on his childhood, and the art saved him. And I feel moderately confident saying that, going back to the woman with all the different personalities, because you don't get multiple personality unless you've been abused. And it's a child who, during the abuse, abstracts themselves and creates other identities. And that seems to be what's going on in Henry Darger, but also he's looking at a lot of films. You can see that. People don't really write about it, but the landscape is the landscape of westerns. You see all these multiple girls, they're probably running across the page. So I think in that respect, he's in culture, but absolutely, he lived on his own. He didn't talk to anyone. I did have one guy come to the museum who said I knew him, which was astonishing, and had been in Chicago and been a friend of his landlord, Nathan Lerner, and said that he sat on the stoop and said nothing. But what's my point? I don't know.
Well, I think you've touched on a paradox there, which is that in some ways, in order to tune in to certain aspects of collectivity, whether it's what's going on the surface of collective culture or what's going on at a less conscious level. It's actually most of us who are kind of flopping around and trying to find our way to the right tube station and pay the electricity bill and this and that and the other. We can't do it. But someone who's actually abstracted, quite literally, from this world, stuck, as Ville was, say, in an asylum, no bills to pay, they can concentrate in a way that none of us can, or very few of us, on a complete sort of recreation of a total world. And I think that to some extent that's what Darger did. And I want to just connect this back to the Living Museum again, because one of the things that Janos Martin says is that the artist's patients, and notice it's artist patients now, not patient artists, they've got nothing to do except make art. So we should all get together and we should establish a kind of Adolf Hilfli scholarship to be, all your bills will be paid for 6 months or 6 years or whatever, and you'll be just shut away in a room with art materials. Go for it.
I think there is one. What's it called? I hate to think.
I suppose the scary side of that would be that it sounds remarkably like an art factory, where people are just given materials and left to produce art, which could then be marketed.
But that's good.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Is that good for them?
Well, wait a second. From a human point of view, I think it is undeniably almost always good. Not always, but almost always. It can give people a sense of achievement. Look, here's my drawing, and so on. Doesn't mean that what they do is outsider art. There's a significant, not an utter and total, but a significant difference between old-fashioned psychiatric hospitals in which people were shut away. They didn't do art therapy, really, because that wasn't invented until the 1950s. But some of them, found different ways to manage to make art, often against very considerable odds. I mean, poor old Martin Ramirez had to hide stuff under his mattress and in his pillow and behind the radiators, because if he didn't, the wood stuff just destroyed it at the end of the day, until somebody found out what he was doing and saw his work and said, stop, keep this.
By the way, those pieces of work now cost $100,000 to $500,000.
Yeah.
I'm just mentioning.
No, I've lost the thread.
In California, there's a place called Creative Growth, which is started in a very similar fashion to Googing, but has not been co-opted in the way that Googing seems to have been. And the guy who runs it, Tom DeMaria, has made it his business to commercialize the artists. He's got them on T-shirts and bags. Marc Jacobs saw the work curated at White Columns by Matthew Higgs. He thought it was so cool, he decided to cover bags and T-shirts and put them in the windows of Marc Jacobs around the world. So those poor artists at Creative Growth got sucked in to the same commercial crap that everybody else does. Is excellent for them, and the money goes back to the Creative Growth Center, where they get more materials, where they can make more art. He splits it down the middle between them and it. It's a fantastic, sustainable way. It's giving a lot to the people who are working there. It's giving art to the rest of the world, and it's ridiculous that actually every local borough doesn't have a number of these places and isn't encouraging them, creating models to put them into existence and enabling them to be self-funding in that way. Because, while I didn't get into it to have a political agenda, there is a political agenda under the surface of all of this, and if you can enable people to be creative, whether or not it's good to look at, I think there isn't a downside at all. When I had the planning at the museum, the planners weren't too keen on our layout, so I had a little neck-chan moment. Yeah.
So I think we're probably running out of time, but I think if everyone's happy to, we'll open up questions to the floor. Yeah. Yes.
Do I need a microphone or shall I shout?
There is a microphone. Yes. So we'll just bring that down to you.
I'd like to thank all three speakers for their most informative and stimulating talks. I regret I hadn't yet been to the museum, but I hope to go this Sunday, the last day. Now, I want to take one question of James Brett, another to Jarvis Cocker. In your website last December, James, you said that you were closing down for Kwanzaa. Now, I had to do research on Google Encyclopedia to discover the name, and apparently it's from the Swahili word Kwanzaa, from the saying Matunda yo Kwanzaa, first fruits, and it was adopted as a Afro-American Cultural Festival by Professor Maulana Karenga in 1965. Now, that's quite fascinating. If there are any African Americans in the audience, they might correct me on this. But what I'd like to ask is whether there's a particular relevance to the outsider art collection in the museum. For instance, do you have any Swahili-inspired or Afro-American artworks which would explain the use of a closing down for Kwanzaa, which is a secular cultural festival from December the 26th to January the 1st, completely non-religious and not related to Christmas or anything else. So a brief question to Jarvis Cocker. I was able to tape on video all 6 parts of your Outside Art serial on Channel 4 back in, was it 98? That was before the age of DVD recorders. Could you tell me whether they are now available as a DVD box set through Channel 4 or through any other source?
No, I've tried to interest people in putting it out as a DVD, mainly because a lot of the interviews that we carried out, there were very long interviews and we could only use tiny bits. And like I say, a lot of the artists have since died, and so I thought it would be interesting for people to be able to see that stuff. But I think it's my fault, really. It was the first time that I'd been involved in making a film for TV, and I put loads and loads of music in it. And you have to pay sync rights and royalties and stuff like that. And so I was told that if somebody wanted to release it, it would cost them something like £300,000 just to clear all the music. So obviously nobody would touch it with a barge pole. So I don't know. I may try and take the music out or something, and because I would like it to be available for people to see if they wanted to.
Thanks very much.
Should we try?
Well, give it a go.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try and do it, because I agree with you. I think it's such a good show, and I fancy we should have a DVD label so we can, even if we've only got one DVD. To answer you about Kwanzaa, well, I could go into lots of comments, but I'm just going to say that on Sunday, the 14th, we're closing for Lupercalia, which is
which
it's a fertility festival from ancient Rome.
So there's no actual artwork in the museum inspired by Afro-American.
We have no Roman artwork. Well, you know, look, it's my website. I just thought it was funny.
Oh, I see.
I've got quite a few things to ask, but one of them being French. The interesting point, I think, about outsider art and the difference between art brut, the other word, is that art brut talks about the art, whereas outsider art focuses on the person, which is a very, very strong social word, being an outsider. It has a lot, we could write, well, there's loads of books written about it. Whereas art brut is kind of a bit more sort of up in the air, and it kind of belongs to art. It doesn't really specify so much on the artist, and it kind of feels that anyone could be part of art brut. Whereas with outside art, you have to be labeled as an outsider. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I don't really agree with you. I mean, I think that the dovetailing of the work and the story of the person who made the work is there in art brut. And if you look at the Cahiers de l'Art Brut, which Dubuffet began publishing in the mid-1960s anyway, he, to his great credit, he went to great lengths not to interpret the work, and that's very important, but to allow the person who made the work to say, whatever it was that's about the work in their own words as far as possible. But there's also a sort of compte rendu of their life. So I think that connection is there just as much in art brut as it is in outsider art, between the life and the work.
But I suppose as terms, I don't know if that's what you mean, that because my French is terrible, even though I've lived there for 7 years, but art brut means kind of raw art, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So I suppose that is more general than saying outsider art, which says this art comes from some other place, whereas by saying it's raw, in some way uncooked by popular culture or dominant culture or whatever, I suppose that does imply it could come from anywhere.
Yeah. And then just another thing was that it's interesting that we haven't really talked about other kinds of art, such as music, for example, where maybe we could apply also outside of art. And I was watching quite a few interviews of the band called Cockrozy, and they do say that they were on the outside very much of the world, and that the music has brought them back into the world and is a way of sort of communicating with a society that they felt didn't accept them. But the fact that people do listen to the music and the fact that people do come to gigs and buy the CDs is kind of reuniting them with the world. And it is a positive action. So of course then it could be deviated into extremes, being put on in adverts and things like that, or on bags for paintings. But in a way it's also quite a beautiful reuniting thing.
Well, there is, you know, Daniel Johnston, who is probably, you know, the one who comes to mind for me. And I remember seeing him play before I really got into this. And it was weird because 50% of the audience, Daniel Johnston is autistic, and he's really, the sound is very unique. It's very his thing, particularly when he plays Live and Let Die. But the audience who was watching him at the time, it was funny. I would say 50% were on his side and 50% wanted to see a car crash. And it gets I think it gets complicated. But that was some years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. And then it's just one of those grey areas. I know, talking about him, Daniel Johnston, when he did the Meltdown, I think when David Bowie did the Meltdown, he got Daniel Johnston to play, and that shows you, you know, it's quite a similar relationship in some ways. But I don't know that there's so many of them. And I wanted to also mention, just going back to your thing about terminology, you know, personally I have a problem with terminology, because I think I know what it is when I look at it, but in some ways it's super irrelevant. It's relevant historically, but it's really not relevant in terms of today. It's contemporary art, actually. When people are living, it's contemporary art. If they're not, it's going back. There are people we show, like there's a guy called Carl Radler who was making art at the turn of the century. He's impressionist, there's no question. So I just don't think it's very helpful to use terminology in this way. It becomes jargon, and then what does it mean? And actually, outsider art, the only reason that ever came to be was because the guy was writing a book about it, and I forget whose name it was. Roger Cardinal, and they didn't like art brut as the title because it was too French and therefore less commercial. So outsider came up as a sort of quick alternate.
Okay. Yes.
James, just following on from what you were saying, I mean, I was going to ask anyway, a lot of what we've heard this evening seems to almost indicate we should abandon these terms altogether. But by your actions, you both seem to be kind of upholding them by, you know, collecting only outsider art, by showing it in its kind of special way away from the art world, and discussing it outside of the rest of the art world. How would you answer that? And is there what's the best reason for upholding the terms?
Well, what are you going to do? I mean, you know, what are you going to do? You're either going to not show it or you're going to show it. So I think, look, I like it. And I'm not going to go into the weird psychology of my own being of why I like it, but it's probably quite weird. But I like it, and I found that other people responded to it in a very positive way, mainly my friends and people who would see it. So we just took it step by step, and it seemed quite a good idea to display it because no one had got off their arse to do it in England. And the one time that it had been done, it was sort of co-opted and went down a side road. And that seemed to me stupid. it just seemed to be a real wasted opportunity. And I think the bottom line is we've had 25,000 people, which is, 25 times more than I thought would come. Most of them don't really want us to close. Definitely, there are some very valid criticisms about showing the work in a space that's not neutral. And that's probably my answer is the same as with the website, which is I thought it was a good idea. And I thought it was funny, but also that it seems to have worked. Somehow there's been some strange connection between the work, and we've managed to get the intention communicated somehow. I think I understand a bit about what goes on in the minds of the people who make it. And I can't really know, but I can try and be sympathetic to it. And I think we just tried to do our best. But if you don't show it together at one time, no one's going to know what it is. So it is important to state it and give these people a voice. And I just give you, one example. There was a guy called Tom Karapich, and we put a tiny piece of his in the show. And we got some email from someone saying, well, this guy used to live on the streets in New York. It's amazing. How did you find it? How did it come to be here? And so on. I feel it's more of a semantic catch-22, what you're asking, even though I do think it's a valid question.
I mean, it just seems very different the way you choose to show outsider art with kind of wonky hand-drawn signs to the way Matthew Higgs would show outsider art, which is putting it in the commercial art world, treating it like any other sort of contemporary art.
Well, I just didn't like what my designers were doing, so I did it. I mean, I didn't think they were catching. I worked with some guys, and I didn't think they caught the feel of it, and I wasn't in favor of wonky hand-drawn signs at the beginning, but it became the right thing. And as many people say it's not the right thing, say it is the right thing, and these are just choices I think you have to make. I'm not saying they're right, but at least we've got to talk at the ICA as a result of the museum. And a book, and just a general interest in this area. So I don't think ultimately it's doing more harm than good.
I mean, I personally really liked the way the museum is laid out because, I don't know, but by having a slightly playful aspect to it, like the cafe at the end and everything. I mean, because throughout our discussion this evening, there's a dark side to this art, or there are uncomfortable things to be faced about it. But I think that was a positive aspect of the gallery, is that it's not you don't feel like you're walking into a scary place, and also because I guess the art isn't conceived in a kind of way of, again we've touched on this, that this is going to be exhibited. So I think the fact that a lot of stuff is crammed in there kind of seems to fit with the idea of it more than if something's put there and kind of taken out of its context and just like let's concentrate on this one thing. So I thought the way the gallery was put together was very good. I'm not just saying that because I'm sat next to you.
Thank you. There's a question up the back.
Supposing you've determined that the problem with outsider art arises when it becomes professionalized. Do you have any plans to, well, since that's an issue in other fields, politics in particular, that have been professionalized, I'm wondering if you have any plans to make a film or a documentary about your project so more of us can see why it's important to keep things pure.
I would do it if Jarvis would front it.
There's no commitment there.
No, I think it's quite difficult, actually. If I really had thought, as a filmmaker, if I'd really thought of a good way to do it, I think I probably would have done. But I don't quite know the way into it because it's so huge as an area, and you've got to start getting very specific. So you can be specific about artists, or you can group them together by genre. You know, sort of, I don't know if you've ever seen The Couch Trip, but sort of, you know, obsessive compulsives over here and schizophrenics over there. And it becomes it's quite tricky, I think, how you do that in a film format. And there have been quite a lot of good films about it. Personally, I find them more successful when they're about one or more artists. Like we showed this film Make, which was a documentary about 4 artists. And it was very effective, and the guy had chosen a number of them and meshed them together. I think Jarvis's film is great because it's a journey, and it's really personal to him. And what's amazing about it is Jarvis is really into it, which is hugely important. And he's taking us by the hand through these different places. I think a sort of overview encyclopedic type of film is not one that I really would know how to do, because I would find it a bit daunting, actually. But if something materialized, I would maybe do it.
I wasn't really suggesting an overall film, but more to your points, which were that you know, this art comes because people need to understand. They need to understand. We all need to understand, so we create things, right? And then we like this outsider art because it's not professional, because it isn't commercial. And that's the angle I'm interested in. And I hope, anyway, you'll do more. Thank you.
Can I just make a point that kind of picks up on that? So I don't like. Can I just make a point that picks up on that? Because I've got an exhibition in the psychiatric hospital coming up, and it's I had an exhibition there 20 years ago when I was a patient, and the work that I did when I was unwell was quite well known, and the work that I'm exhibiting this time is like ex-art student art, the sort of stuff that everybody does, which actually you have to know something about art to appreciate. The point about the kind of work I did when I was a patient is that that actually has strong emotional qualities, and which have a broad appeal. And the work that I produce normally is much more refined and focused. And it's very difficult in the culture that we live in to come up with a body of work that perhaps encompasses all the kind of people that one would like to be and could possibly be at any point in time.
And what do you think when you look at the work?
It's not really a question.
When you look at the work that you produced all those years ago, how do you feel about that now?
Well, I feel that it was quite disinhibited. I think it was very disinhibited, and it probably was a good thing for me to do at the time. But there's a difference between expressing an emotion and portraying an emotion. And a lot of the work you tend to do when you're psychotic or in altered states is you're betraying information about yourself, you're betraying information about your state of mind and your interests, because you're not in a position where you want to keep these sorts of things in. Whereas normally when you're functioning, when you're producing art, you're actually producing it as a sort of with one's normal self or normally structured self, more or less intact. I mean, I went to see the museum today, and I've seen an outside art exhibition before. And actually, I came out with a very strong wish to go and see a tissue or a goose because it makes you realise just what an extraordinary piece of humanity these are. To a large extent, the story of outsider art. I feel to a certain extent there's some, a certain amount of people defending a brand here. I feel it's part of the history of modern art. It's part of the history of modernism. And it wouldn't have been art in the 18th century.
But aren't we really looking at a sort of spectrum here? Where at one end of the spectrum, for all sorts of reasons, there's a wish to order things and to compose things and balance and harmonize and all the rest, which I, respect. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's a need to do almost the opposite, to disorder, to deconstruct, to unbalance, Now, personally, okay, for reasons I probably better not go into, I'm more inclined to the disordered side of things. But in a sense, those needs are equally valid and equally strong. And so, of course, you can find, your Poussin or your Vasarely or whatever that seems to be all very kind of well thought out and composed, in every sense of the word, composed. And on the other hand, you have, I don't know, Soutine, Jackson Pollock, the wild and wayward. I mean, one thing is for sure that when Dubuffet began collecting Art Brut, it was the disorderly side of the spectrum, as it were, that he gravitated towards very fiercely.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because it's like, I suppose, as modern art has become more intellectual, it's almost like it needs something like this, which is not intellectual at all, really. Which I guess that's what you're saying, is like it's like something just comes out in a big, like a splurge like that. Sometimes without, people really knowing what they're doing. And maybe that's the kind of thing of something trying to balance things up. Do you know what I mean? That as things become more refined, you need something to remind you of the original impulse of things.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that also, your experience is particular to you, and your perception of the work is different to how mine would be. And, the privacy, or you mentioned betrayal, and I can completely understand that. And there's certainly, there's work we chose not to show in the museum because it was too private, or it was, it just wasn't necessarily the right thing to be showing that, because it was too intimate or revealed too much about its maker. And those are issues that come up. But the idea of having a contrast was probably the simplest fact. The fact that you can go and see the Titian is great, but until we opened the museum, you couldn't see the alternative to the Titian in London. So that's what I would just answer to that.
Thank you. And just this lady over here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about the ethics of curating and showing this kind of work, because I think my experience of going into the Museum of Everything was I was very much thrown by the entrance, which to me signified a kind of aesthetics of a freak show aesthetic. It was a kind of roll up, circus style kiosk at the entrance, and that put me in a really bad mood to try and engage with the work, because I thought it was reinforcing perceptions that might have been talking about the kind of work anyway. I think it's notable also that we've got not a single artist speaking on the panel, we have people who are speaking on behalf of. So that question of ethics of presentation is something that hasn't really been addressed yet. We don't have anybody speaking for themselves. So that's even further reinforced by the conversation of this panel.
Well, I would say we had lots of artists speaking at the museum, artists who are alive. We made it our business to bring them in. And in terms of the aesthetics, I mean, again, I just say that goes down to choice. I was interested in having people see the show. So, frankly, you've got the content and you've got the marketing, and you try and tie them together. Definitely, you can't please everybody, and I'm sorry if we didn't please you. But at the same time, hopefully, if you like this kind of work, you went in and you went past the terrible set decoration and actually looked at the work for what it was and appreciated that we'd hung it up, that we'd presented it well, that we tried to connect it to contemporary art to some extent by asking people who were really inspired by it, like Jarvis, what their feelings and thoughts were. And we definitely, it's not, there's an element of the freak show simply because there's a voyeuristic element connected with this kind of work. It's inevitable. But it's only presentation, and it's how you present it. The reason I called it the Museum of Everything, which is probably relevant to this, is that I didn't like all these terms, and I wanted it to be a question mark. So the name was a question mark, where you found it was a question mark, what your feelings were going in. There wasn't that much indication of what it was until you actually started to see it. And the reason I came to that name is because it's the original name of a art installation on the Isle of Wight by an 86-year-old man called William Brett, who has the same name as me, where he's taken all the things of his life and put them in an old schoolhouse, and he called it the Museum of Everything. And I just thought this was a fantastic idea. And in fact, a few weeks ago I went to visit him because we'd only spoken on the phone, and lo and behold, as I walk towards his garden, there are these sculptures in the garden, these fence posts of penguins that he's painted, which I didn't know about at all. So on top of everything else, he's a sort of possum trot type carver and creator. And it reinforced my certainty that actually these were good choices because they're connected somehow. So I do understand what you're saying, but I think you've got to make a choice, and I didn't want to be neutral. I didn't see why I had to.
But I think, actually, can I just respond to that last question? I think there are some very real ethical issues, and I guess one place in which they become very obvious is in our relationship to the work produced in these studios for people with severe learning disabilities, where on the one hand, it's a wonderful thing from a human point of view that they have, something that gives them certain fairly obvious rewards in terms of being able to achieve and create and so on. But when some of this work, and it's only some, is kind of, as it were, filtered out and labeled as outsider art, I have a problem with myself about this. Why have I kind of picked on this work as being of special interest or value, and the rest, in a sense, has a different and possibly lower or more mundane sort of value? I think that is, quite a tricky ethical issue, which is really about us as viewers, consumers, collectors, curators, or whatever.
But and also, sorry, if it wasn't out there, you wouldn't be able to ask the question. And that's really my point. If you've not got a platform to present a differing opinion, then
That's like saying if it wasn't exploited, this is a very basic way, if we weren't exploiting people, we wouldn't be asking questions about exploitation.
Maybe, but I stand by it. I think if we hadn't put on the show, you wouldn't come here and ask that question because it would still be something in a textbook.
But there are other exhibitions. There is a difference between the aesthetic of the Museum of Everything, say, and the one in Fife, the Art Extraordinary Museum up there, has a very different tenor to it. And I think that's why I was very much struck by the way that this was put together, the way it was curated, and the particular aesthetic and the ethics that are implied in that aesthetic of presentation.
Well, look, I can't tell you. I feel very comfortable with our ethical approach to this art. I don't think we've been offensive or patronizing, and if we have, I apologize.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, I don't know, is this the final question?
We'll do one more.
Okay. James, I had the privilege of coming to the Museum of Everything as I'm involved with the ICA on another level, and you were fortunately there and were able to walk us through the entire exhibition and give us a snapshot of the artists and the world that they'd come from. And my overwhelming feeling when I left the Museum of Everything, apart from the fact I haven't stopped talking about it since I left, was I loved the way when you walked in it was so approachable and accessible, and that it did have that roll-up feeling, like a fairground. And also it left me feeling that I wanted to know more actually about the person who had put together this collection, i.e. yourself, of extraordinary artifacts and paintings and pictures that you had the vision to be able to put all of those things together in one place and open it to the public. Not only was I thinking about getting into the mind of some of the artists, but also getting into the mind of you collecting all of those items and bringing them together. And I thought that that was really clever in itself. So it was a whole experience, including the person who'd actually gathered up those pictures, and it was actually one of the cleverest things that I've seen in a very long time. Not a question, a statement, sorry.
Well, I'll answer that, because I think they're the same question, actually. You know, look, it's not clever, it's just, well, thank you, but I don't think it's clever. I just think we went and did it, and we did it in the best way that we thought, because we saw that nobody was looking at this work and nobody was celebrating the work. And really all we did was find a suitable building, work out how to do a layout, ask lots of our friends how they thought we should do it, and then come up with a style. And I've been thinking about what you're saying about, you know, roll up, and it's not meant to be a freak show. You know, probably it's got more to do with going to the fun fair and being a child. And that's probably much more connected to the feeling of it and what you feel there than it is about being the sideshow owner and, you know, abusing the bearded lady. I think that that's just a point of view we went into putting it together. So, you know, for us, and there's a lot of us, it's certainly not just me, the satisfaction is people turning up, and we see what they write about it. So there seems to I just go back to saying there seems to be some very fundamental connection that people are making by looking at this kind of work, which is only satisfying because we didn't know that before we put it all together. We knew that we had, you know, certainly that I knew that the people sitting here were fans, but I didn't know, you know, all of you were fans, or some of you.
And if does anyone else have a question? I think someone back there had a question. No?
I just wanted to say it was a wonderful experience, and me and many other people who went I'm all right, okay. I had so much pleasure going around. I went around last Thursday and Thursday before, and it was packed. And everybody there was smiling. People weren't looking at it, analysing it, they were just really enjoying it. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and I thank you to all of the speakers for their time.